Hello and welcome to episode 179 of the Book Binge, where we're discussing the benefits of rereading. This is a question that I asked in a couple of Discord servers. Had a few of these little guinea pigs of mine. Little did these little guinea pigs of mine know it was to gauge them for a video. Well, I think I actually said in the question of the day, maybe I did, that I planned to use the results of these for a little bit of a video. But either way, we're talking about, like I said, the benefits of rereading. I took opinions from people, the people who tend to reread versus the people who don't, and what their reasons were for that, and basically compiled them into a few groups and included a little bit of myself to talk about at the end of the video. I don't really have much more to say for preamble here. I might as well just jump right into things. I split people into, I believe, 3 different groups. There are the rereaders, the people who do tend to reread for one reason or another, the non-rereaders, the people who usually tend to avoid doing that, and then the others, people who don't really fit fully into one of the 2 previous groups. Let's start off covering the rereaders. I had about 16 people respond as being rereaders, and this list of things is going to be the list of reasons why some of these people tend to reread. First and foremost, there are the classic old reliables that even non-rereaders tend to return to. There are books such as the one that I held up in the thumbnail of this video, like The Lord of the Rings, one of the few books that I own more than 3 copies of. In fact, I think it's the only book that I own more than 3 copies of currently. That will change very soon with Sun Eater. This is something that is generally old reliable for a lot of people, something that people tend to read quite regularly or have read several times throughout their lives, and sometimes go back to even still relatively often, regardless of whether they tend to reread other books or not. Sometimes there are favorites that are just fun to return to. Comfort reads are definitely reliable to give you a boost if you happen to be in a slump, or if interest in new stuff tends to dwindle. There are some of these comfort reads or old favorites that are fun to return to. For me, sometimes I return to some Rick Riordan books that I've been enjoying to read over the last couple years, where I've had gaps in other time, or where I've just been in the mood to reread some old favorites from when I was younger to see if they hold up, and I've been rereading those for that reason. Sometimes it's also fun to go back and look at old favorites with fresh and older eyes. Sometimes it's nice to go back on books that maybe you didn't like as much with fresh and old wizened eyes. And by old wizened eyes, I'm of course being metaphorical, saying somebody who's grown a little bit since the first time they tried to read a book. Even somebody trying to read a book and not liking it as a teenager and then coming back in their mid-20s can come back and be older and wiser looking on the experience. Some people want to see if favorites actually hold up, as I mentioned. Sometimes it's just great to see foreshadowing and similar stuff that you might have missed the first time, such as, stuff leading to the major finale of the series or of a book specifically that you maybe didn't see coming the first time around, but because you now know that that event is coming, rereading it lets you know that there was a lot of lead up to that, actually. Sometimes people just change a little bit over time, and their perspectives also change with them. So re-experiencing a book that one may have liked or not can be enlightening to see the way that one has changed, whether something holds up or not, or the way that their opinion on something has changed majorly. Sometimes a book does not work for you. As I hinted at before, sometimes it just doesn't click, sometimes you just don't like it, sometimes there's just something in the way of you enjoying it. So coming back with a new perspective, or when you might be a little bit more ready for that book, can change everything. This is similar to the previous post, seeing stuff with new eyes, but is also a little bit different insofar as instead of seeing if something holds up, it's going back and seeing how much you've changed might affect your reading experience. Sometimes you might not like a book at all, and then you try reading it again and realize that maybe you just didn't understand it. Maybe sometimes you read a book and you know that you don't understand it, so you push it off for a little bit later and then try it again, and now you love it when you try it again. These are all very normal things. Sometimes rereads, especially for shorter and easier books, but even just for old favorites, no matter how hard they are, if you happen to be familiar with them, sometimes they're just good palate cleansers, something that, feels fresh yet familiar, something to make the TBR and moving on to new books a little bit easier if you go back to experience something you're familiar with, to give your brain a little bit of a break, maybe. Books that are nostalgic from when you're younger, from a simpler time perhaps, that some people said. Sometimes you remember loving a book, but you forget everything else, so you just kind of use it in between as like a refresher. Sometimes you think back on books that change you or are otherwise important to your childhood or your teenage years or whenever it was you read a certain book, and to re-experience that, even if you feel the exact same, is good. Sometimes looking back on a book with new fresh eyes doesn't actually tell you anything new about the book, you just love it the same, and that can be really refreshing in its own way. Certain books are meant to be reread, certain books are not. By this I mean there are books like Sun Eater or Book of the New Sun where reading it for the second time lets you see it with a whole new perspective, regardless of how long of a break you take in between the rereads. This is something that I've experienced recently, but there are also other books, usually, at least for me, like Rick Riordan books that I read when I was younger, that, rereading is simply just me re-experiencing the thing that I really enjoyed when I was younger without necessarily having to look at it with fresh new eyes. Certain things feel a little bit different just because of being older, but overall, certain books can serve different purposes in the form of rereading. Sometimes rereading a book or wanting to reread books can be as simple as getting out of or avoiding reading slumps. I think I hinted at this with a couple of the previous points. If you're going into a reading slump and you really don't enjoy any of the books you're reading, or you feel like you're looking at a book on the shelf or going to the library and nothing interests you, sometimes you'll have a spark from an old favorite that you're just like, that looks good, I want to reread that. And then you reread it, and then you're kind of back in the groove, and then you're able to go on and read new books. Sometimes rereading can be very helpful for this. Finally, in a big or a long series, this was something that several people talked about, even if there's just a lot of time between releases, rereading the series up to that point before the new release can be, kind of a traditional thing to do. A lot of people who are big fans of the Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson have been doing this with each release. They read Way of Kings, close to release, or read Way of Kings and Words of Radiance, and really enjoyed those, but then it was a few years until Oathbringer, so they reread the first two books before Oathbringer, and then they did the same thing before Rhythm of War, and I know plenty of people who are planning to do the exact same thing with those first four books altogether before Wind and Truth comes out later this year. I think just a couple months from now at the time that this video comes out, actually. So rereading just to refresh your memory of a previous set of or previous entries of a series when it's a long time in between releases up until a new release is definitely pretty useful too. So these are a lot of the reasons that people gave for rereading books. As for the non-rereaders, I had 11 people who specifically said they weren't really into rereading, and there were less unique reasons for this. I think most of the reasons that people gave for this can be boiled down to 4 simple points for the most part. Certain people are more interested in experiencing new books and don't really want to read older books because of that. Certain people feel like books that they read when they were younger was more of a gateway to some of the things that they enjoy nowadays, and so going back to reread that thing might make them feel like it was lesser and therefore, make their memory of it less fond, and so ruin that kind of experience for them. I can totally understand where people come from with this complaint too. In general, sometimes the TBR is too big. Sometimes it's just a little bit too unwieldy to keep track of all the books that you want to read, and so, handling books that you may want to reread just takes a little bit too much time. This is something that I kind of talked about in a couple of books previously on the channel, between one where I talked about the problem with to-do lists, talking about how the TBR is basically like a fractal, and then also another video where I just talked about mood reading versus TBR reading, some of the reasons why people chose to mood read versus TBR read, and some reasons why people chose to stick to a strict schedule was specifically because of influenced by rereads and stuff like this as well. Sometimes, if you happen to be like me, you might just read a little bit too slow or read too infrequently to allow space for rereads because, well, you have too many new books to experience that you won't have time to experience, and this is the reason that a lot of people might not reread very much, regardless of how quick or slow you read. There's just not enough time in the world to read every single book that you might be interested in reading, so rereading ones that you've already experienced might not be worth the time for certain people. But this leads us into the group of others, as I called them, people who, kind of fall in a different position, that might fall in between, that might fall in a new position entirely, primarily because of their own specific reason. There were about 8 people who I could categorize in this. Some of these people identified with one of the 2 sides that I already talked about, but, because of their reasons kind of fell in a different position, so I put them here. But 8 people fell into the others. Some people reread books often, but never read a book more than twice. There were a couple people who do this quite a bit. Like they might read a book, then a few years down the line reread it, but then never read it again, just to re-experience it. And they go through this with several of their old favorites. They have a lot of books that they like and that they reread at some point or another, but they'd never read it more than twice because then it becomes wasting time for them. These people obviously tend to lead a little bit towards the former, the people who do enjoy rereads, because these people are rereading a lot of books, just not like incessantly rereading, right? Some people simply come back to favorite chapters, specifically within books that they really like. This leans towards the latter, people who don't really reread books, but if there was a moment that they really specifically remember enjoying a lot, might reread. As an example, I'm somebody who might at some point in the future go back and reread not Wizard and Glass, the entire book, and not The Dark Tower, the entire series, but might read parts 2 and 3 of Wizard and Glass specifically because it stands alone enough from the rest of the series, and I loved it so much, probably my favorite single section of the series, that I might reread the section of the book just to reread that section without being beholden to all 8 books again. And it turns out I actually lied. This doesn't actually boil down to 4 points, this boils down to only 3. And this is the third point. Sometimes you're really in the mood to reread a book. Sometimes you're in a mode that makes them unattractive. This is a fairly neutral point. Sometimes, and I think this could be influenced by stuff like being in a reading slump. Sometimes you might just be in the mood to reread a book for some reason unbeknownst to you. And then some other times you might, look at the idea of rereading a book and be like, why would I want to do that when I have this other new book to read? Sometimes you might just fall right in the middle, and it depends entirely on your mood. As for my personal opinion on this topic, I love rereading. I'm particularly into rereading for reasons of nostalgia, comfort reads, and palate cleansers. I'm also quite young. Much of what I've read I've loved from my teens, and a lot of that stuff I have forgotten because of such a big space of not really reading very much, not really paying attention to much of what was going on with my reading, and a lot of books that I read part of and remember enjoying but not finishing. And so some of these I count as like partial rereads to a degree, kind of a technicality on my part. So they fit perfectly here for the purposes that I tend to reread, having palate cleansers to read in the middle of stuff, books that are just nostalgic that really make reading exciting again whenever I'm not feeling as excited about reading for some reason, and having a comfort read in the midst of a lot of complex stuff really makes for something special in a reading journey, and this is where I personally fall. I totally see and understand the people who don't really want to reread or not really being able to justify doing so for themselves. For example, my personal Sun Eater reread has been complicating my normal TBR for several months now, and by several months I mean like over a year at this point. At the time that this video comes out, it's been well over a year that I've been rereading Sun Eater and doing work on that kind of stuff, and rereading those books has definitely complicated the TBR a bit. It's definitely taken a little bit more time out of my general TBR than I would have preferred, but I've been enjoying that stuff, don't get me wrong, but it has affected my TBR, there is no doubt of that, and I hope to be mostly cleared of that within a year's time or so. We'll kind of see how things go, but I would like to be mostly out of the rereading phase by a year or so that I can get back to using my TBR a little bit more fully in other areas. So I may love rereading, but sometimes rereading does complicate the TBR, so I understand where people come from if they are not rereaders. If you did not participate in the question of the day where I asked in a couple Discord servers about whether you tend to reread or not and what your reasons might be, shout off your reasons in the comments below. Or even if you did participate in that question of the day, shout off your reasons in the comment below as well. I want to get a discussion going, see how many people fall in certain different areas, and if you happen to have new reasons, especially new reasons that you may or may not reread, shout those out. I would be interested to know. Maybe some of them I even personally also fall into but completely didn't realize. That's always a possibility. Either way, thank you for checking out this video. If you did, I'll be back in the next video, whatever that may be.